Recently, in one of our features, we took a trip down memory lane and reminisced about gaming in the 90s, and we quite enjoyed it. So we figured, why not go further back? And back is where we'll go in this feature, as we talk about some things that defined much of the industry in the 1980s. Obviously, there's a lot that the 80s and 90s had in common, so of which we've already spoken about in our previous aforementioned feature, you won't see us repeating those things here. So with all of that out of the way, let's get started. Sidescrollers. There was a time when video games were synonymous with a very particular kind of look and design. Whether it was action-adventure titles, shooters, platformers, or just pure action games, side-scrollers dominated the scene. That was largely due to the limitations that the hardware of the time placed on game developers back then, but it surely didn't stop developers from expressing their creativity. From Contra to Metroid to Ninja Gaiden to Super Mario Bros., these were all vastly different experiences in spite of being side-scrollers. Arcades. Before computer gaming, handheld gaming, or console gaming, before all of it, the dominant way to play video games was with arcades. From Space Invaders to Pac-Man, these were all the progenitors of our industry, and going to arcades and slotting coins into machines to play games was the status quo. Even after console gaming emerged and grew in popularity, arcades still stuck around for a long time, especially within the fighting game genre. But back during the late 70s and early 80s, arcade gaming was at its peak. Atari. Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft dominate the console market now, and until a couple of decades ago, Sega was also a force to be reckoned with. But if we go even further back, even before Nintendo arrived on the scene with the NES, it was Atari that was leading the market. Sure, the industry was a lot less competitive back then, but Atari was still a formidable presence in the gaming market. They ultimately bowed out after the third console generation, with the Atari 7800 being their last major console. The rise of handheld gaming. Handheld gaming, whether that's on dedicated consoles, or on mobile devices and tablets, or on whatever the hell the Switch is an integral part of our industry. But it wasn't always this way. It was during the 1980s that the very concept of dedicated handheld games even emerged. The Game Boy came out in 1989, but the roots of handheld gaming can be traced further back, to handheld electronic games, also known as Game & Watch games or brick games. Severely limited by hardware capabilities, these were little more than the most rudimentary kind of experiences imaginable, but they worked and they were fun, and without them, it's fair to say handheld gaming probably wouldn't even be a thing. Code saves. Back in the 80s, something as simple as save states was a very rare thing. Saving games required additional memories, and since games mostly used to run on ROM cartridges, getting that additional memory was either impossible or extremely expensive. So game developers devised a clever way to allow players to have something close to save states: passwords. At the end of every level, players would get passwords or codes that when inputted would immediately load up that point in the game. Though the games themselves had no information of players' progress, by simply loading into a particular point in the game through codes, players could still retain their progress. Special cartridges. Special editions, collector's editions, deluxe editions, and what have you are a dime a dozen these days, to the point where they no longer even feel all that special anymore. Back during the 80s, Nintendo's special cartridges truly did feel special. What exactly were these? Well, certain releases from Nintendo would receive the special treatment, and they'd release these games on unique-looking cartridges. Zelda games, for instance, would always come on golden cartridges. This, in fact, became a tradition that Nintendo kept until very recently. Even in 2011, The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword came on golden discs. Nintendo Hotline. We live in the age of the internet, when getting stuck on a game basically leads to 5 minutes of research. Check a walkthrough, read a guide, watch a video, and you immediately know what to do next. No one really gets stuck in games anymore. Back in the day though, people weren't so lucky. When you got stuck, you got stuck. You could check a magazine, sure, but you weren't always guaranteed to get the information that you needed. So what would you do? Well, Nintendo had a special hotline called the Nintendo Power Line, just for this purpose. Upon getting stuck in a game, you could call up this number, and people who answered would give you tips about how to progress. And they almost always knew what to do. The power line, in fact, lived quite a long life. Established in the late 80s, it was active until as recent as 2010. With the advent of the information era, though, obviously it had to go away. Super hard games. Games that challenge us with grueling difficulty aren't so difficult to find even today. There's a very strong audience in the market for that kind of game, in fact, and titles such as Dark Souls, Cuphead, and the bevy of games Dark Souls has inspired have found a lot of success. But here's the thing, this is a very particular section of the industry. Back in the 80s, it was more than just a section. It was more or less a norm, and games were hard, super hard. A lot of it was a holdover of arcade gaming, where the games were designed to be hard so that players would keep failing and feeding more coins into the machine for another go. Even beyond plain and simple difficulty, simple things such as a lack of quality of life features made games harder and at times more frustrating than they needed to be. RPGs. RPGs are one of the pillars of this industry. It's one of the most beloved and successful genres in gaming, to the point where developers often unnecessarily cram RPG elements into games where they don't necessarily belong. And it all began in the 1980s. RPGs began to pick up steam in the gaming space in the late 70s, taking inspiration from classic pen and paper role-playing games. Then, in the early 80s, came the likes of Ultima and Wizardry, and the rest, of course, is history. Legendary franchises. The Legend of Zelda, Super Mario, Metroid, Metal Gear, Ninja Gaiden, Mega Man. These are some of the most legendary and widely beloved franchises in the industry, and have all influenced games in huge ways. So, what do they all have in common? They were all created in the 1980s. This was a decade when gaming as we know it was in its infancy, when things we now take for granted were emerging as revolutionary, groundbreaking ideas, and these franchises led the charge with these ideas. They set trends that became staples, and many even created genres single-handedly. Offbeat sequels. All too often, we complain about sequels playing it too safe and refusing to take risks. Some do, of course, but when a developer strikes gold on its first attempt, they tend to stick with what they did well in the first game with the sequel. This wasn't always the case back during the 80s, and developers would often make very, very different mainline sequels to successful games. Nintendo did this quite a lot. In fact, Zelda 2, Super Mario Bros. 2, and Metroid 2 were all very different games from their predecessors. In fact, they're the sort of experiences these franchises haven't gone back to with future installments ever since. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from Gaming Bolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.